Hello, I'm Claire Smith and welcome to my channel. So today I'm going to be talking through the Penhaligons Potions and Remedies line of fragrances. There are 5 fragrances in this line and you can buy a sample kit from the Penhaligons website for £30 for 5 2ml vials. So I am just going to talk you through that sample kit and tell you about how each of the fragrances smell and also whether I'd be interested in buying full bottles of those fragrances, and I'm also going to rank the fragrances in my order of preference at the end of the video. So if you haven't seen me before, I'm Claire Smith. I make videos all about perfume, perfume science, perfume history, perfume psychology even, and I also just do some straight perfume reviews and also fun perfume tags. So if that kind of content appeals to you, then please do consider subscribing, and also please like this video if you do like this kind of content. So first of all, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Penhaligons fragrance brand in case you don't know much about them. So they were launched back in the 1870s by William Penhaligon. He was a barber in London and he released the first fragrance in 1872. They didn't really get much success until really the second half of the 20th century. And at that point, they gained a few royal warrants. In fact, they're still suppliers to King Charles III of toiletries. And they really trade on their Britishness. They try to market their fragrances using advertising that plays on British eccentricities. They use cartoons, quite a lot of Victorian cartoon kind of style advertising. And I think this line really fits with that kind of brand ethos. I always find the Penhaligons brand a little bit confusing because when you actually look into who owns Penhaligons now, it's not actually a British brand anymore at all. It's actually owned by the Catalan conglomerate brand Puig, who actually own loads of different fragrance brands, including Paco Rabanne, Carolina Herrera, Nina Ricci, Byredo, also L'artisan Perfume, and also Dries Van Noten. So it's just really weird, isn't it? So going back to this fragrance line, these fragrances retail for £195 for 100ml. So it's definitely worth trying them with that sample set first to make sure you're getting the right one, because there aren't travel size options for this fragrance line and there aren't 30ml bottles, which is really quite annoying, I think, for a lot of people. So I'm just going to talk through each one of these in turn now and tell you what I think of them. So the first fragrance in the line is called A Balm of Calm, and this fragrance was formulated by Juliet Karagözoglu, and this fragrance is supposed to evoke feelings of calmness and also to reduce anxiety in the wearer, according to Penhaligons, and that's because they say this fragrance contains notes of lavender and also sandalwood. So to me, this really did make me feel calmer. I agree with them. It is a very sort of tranquil feeling fragrance. Really, in the opening of this fragrance, it's very aromatic, but it's aromatic in a very gentle, not sharp kind of way. It's more like a fluffy aromatic feel. It actually makes me think of just getting into a bed of clean sheets, probably pastel blue sheets. It's got a slightly cool feel to it. To me, this really smells more like clary sage than it does lavender. I don't know whether there is some lavender here. I find them quite difficult to discern from each other sometimes, but I think this fragrance just overall is quite soft. Sometimes clary sage can be quite shower jelly, and it's not like that in this fragrance at all. So as this dries down, it becomes creamier, and I think that's probably the sandalwood, but really it sort of goes into that sort of slightly green sandalwood where it could be fig almost. And it is quite a woody fragrance overall, but in the background there's a slight touch of leather. But I think if you don't like leather, it's really not something that's overt, it's just gently in the background. I did find this fragrance very calming, I did like it, but I do think this fragrance made me think of other fragrances. It didn't feel that original. So this fragrance did make me think of Gris Chanel by BDK, and I tried them side by side, and I would say that they do have resemblance to each other in the midsection, but BDK is much less long lasting than this one. And I would also say that I actually prefer this one over Gris Chanel. I'm not a huge fan of BDK fragrances. I think this one's a nicer fragrance. I also would compare this one to aspects of Jazz Club. So I think this fragrance has a listed note of rum. I think it also has that clary sage, and it just has sort of a feel to it that makes me think of Jazz Club. They're not that similar, but they have elements to them that really do give a feel of that fragrance. This fragrance lasted a decent amount of time on my skin, and I would say this one's kind of a middling one in how strong or weak these fragrances are. You can smell it from a distance for the first few hours at least. So that's a Balm of Calm. The second fragrance is called Oh the Audacity, and this fragrance was formulated by Dominique Ropignon, and according to Penhaligons, this fragrance is supposed to evoke feelings of boldness and confidence because it contains notes of vanilla and incense. So how did this smell to me? Well, when I first sprayed this, I was really struck by a few things. So first of all, just how smoky it was. 2, just how strong it was. And 3, just how much it reminded me of another fragrance. So this opens pretty much as it dries down. Really, the opening does have a little touch of saffron, maybe a little bit of ambroxan. It does smell a little bit plasticky almost in the opening, which I can get sometimes with saffron. But really, as somebody who absolutely hates saffron mostly in fragrances when it's done badly, this is not so bad on the saffron. It's something that I'm perfectly okay with. Really, as this dries down, it's a sweet, woody, smoky, resinous vanilla fragrance. It's almost sort of like a caramelized, sugary kind of vanilla, resinous, woody, smoky fragrance. And I think if you know that kind of DNA, you're probably going to guess which fragrance I'm going to compare this one to. This fragrance really made me think of YSL's Baby Cat, but I would say that Baby Cat is richer, it's smoother, it's the nicer fragrance of the two for me. But I would say that this one is a little bit more gentle. It's not quite so in your face as Baby Cat. Baby Cat can be just a bit strong and a bit too much. And really, these two fragrances are a very similar price point. I think Baby Cat retails for something like £260 for 125ml, and this fragrance is retailing for £195 for 100ml. So it's not really that massive a difference in price, but maybe there was a big difference in availability in 2023, especially in the US, where I know Baby Cat was in short supply. So maybe Penhaligons were trying to take advantage of that situation slightly, and were perfectly happy for Dominique Ropignon to dupe his own fragrance. But I just found it a bit disappointing that I've kind of smelt this before in something very recently. But, you know, it is a likeable DNA. It is something that's mass appealing. I don't think you can really go wrong with smoky vanilla, can you? This fragrance also did make me think of the other smoky vanilla, really, By the Fireplace, but really they're quite different fragrances. By the Fireplace is very much more smoky, and it just has a sort of slightly tarry feel by the fireplace, whereas this one is very much more just a more gentle vanilla fragrance. This fragrance didn't last as long as Baby Cat on my skin, and I would say that Baby Cat is the richer, more full fragrance out of the two. So yeah, I thought this fragrance was fine. It's not necessarily my taste. I'm not really a vanilla-y kind of person, but I think this would be mass appealing, and I think a lot of people would enjoy this one. So that's Oh the Audacity. So the next fragrance is called Kiss of Bliss, and this fragrance was formulated by Caroline Dumour, and it's supposed to imbue feelings of good fortune in the wearer, and that's because, according to Penhaligons, it has notes of clover, jasmine and moss. So this fragrance, when I first spray it, I really get a lot of texture from it. And it makes me think of a sweet textured cloud almost. It really has that kind of almost foggy feeling to it, or cotton wool kind of feeling, or, something where there's sort of some density to it, but it's still quite light and airy. So really this fragrance as well in the opening made me think very strangely of both the texture, but also a very, very mild version of the taste and smell of prawn crackers. And I'm guessing that's because this fragrance has matcha, and that can sometimes make fragrances smell a little bit fishy almost to me, and I think that's what I'm getting in this fragrance. But it's also quite a green and musky fragrance, and the musky tones in this fragrance are, I think, coming from ambroxan and also a bit of cashmere. And if you're really sensitive to ambroxan and you're not so keen on cashmere, I would stay well away from this one, because it's just quite dense with those two things, even though it is still quite an airy fragrance overall. There's also a light Hedione style jasmine in this fragrance, and the Hedione style jasmine is more of like an airy, almost sort of slightly green but not quite kind of style of jasmine, rather than like the jasmine that's in Alien or something like that, or a more indolic jasmine. It's not those kinds of styles of jasmine. As this dries down, it gets more powdery, and also I begin to smell more of a greenness, and it's kind of like a fresh greenness. And I see that there's clover listed in this fragrance. And yes, it makes me think of the clover flowers rather than the clover leaves and stems. It's very much sort of got like a cottony feel to it almost. So this fragrance didn't really remind me of anything. I actually found this fragrance relatively unique. I think the matcha in this fragrance did make me think of other matcha fragrances that I've tried. So of course it made me think of fragrances like Matcha Meditation because it's got the jasmine, it's got the matcha. With Kiss of Bliss, this was probably the hardest fragrance of the 5 for me to wear. It's just not something that I enjoy in fragrance, that sort of cottony feel and that texture that you can get with fragrances like this. When there's a lot of cashmere in, it just is a bit much for me. And this is not necessarily something that I gravitate towards. Also, that kind of slightly fishy feel at the beginning kind of put me off. Once I smelt the fishiness, that was it. I was kind of over this fragrance. But yeah, I think this definitely could be a love for some people. It's very, very different and it does stand out. It's something that I haven't really smelt before. So that's Kiss of Bliss. So the next fragrance is called Liquid Love, and unsurprisingly, this is deemed by Penhaligons to be a love potion, and it was formulated by Nicolas Beaulieu. And this fragrance contains the keynotes of rose and ginger. So how did this smell to me? Well, this opens really beautifully. I really like the opening of this fragrance. So it's a very fresh pink rose and it feels very sparkly. So it's something that smells almost a little bit zingy almost, as well as being sparkly and fresh. But the rose in this fragrance, it's almost like you can smell the green sappiness of the stem. It's almost like someone snapped the stems almost. You can almost smell even the thorns. It's very realistically a fresh pink rose. So actually, as this dries down, it becomes less realistically that fresh pink rose and turns more into a red rose. The rose definitely becomes richer and the fragrance gets warmer, muskier, more powdery and also woodier. And really in the dry down, there's something that really sort of piques my attention just because I've looked at the notes, but I think I probably wouldn't have known what this was. There's a slightly dry, almost dusty feel in the dry down. It's really not something overt or something that's too much, but it just keeps you sniffing. And I'm guessing that might be the turmeric in the dry down of the fragrance. But there's no way I'd pick that out if I hadn't looked at the notes. So I'm not sure whether that's something that's in my head, considering that I obviously have looked at the notes of this fragrance. So did this fragrance remind me of other things? Well, yes, it's a peppery rose. Of course it reminded me of other things. There are loads of peppery roses out there. So it made me think of other Penhaligons fragrances, for example, Elizabethan Rose, which I tried in my last Penhaligons testing video. I'll leave that link down below in case you haven't seen it and you do want to check it out. But Elizabethan Rose is quite an old school feeling peppery rose, and I would say that this fragrance is definitely more modern and it's definitely more gentle than Elizabethan Rose. This fragrance also made me think of a Dries Van Noten fragrance, a Raving Rose. So that fragrance is a very zingy, very peppery rose, and this one did make me think of that. But I think I like the Dries Van Noten a little bit more than this one, but still this one's very nice. Obviously Dries Van Noten are also a Puig brand, so that would figure, wouldn't it? I think, yeah, it's perfectly nice. The opening was absolutely my favourite part of this fragrance. The dry down less so. But yeah, I enjoyed wearing this one and it was reasonably long lasting. It was reasonably strong as well. No complaints with this one, so that's Liquid Love. So the final fragrance in this collection is called Vroom. And this fragrance was actually formulated by Quentin Biche. And the fragrance is supposed to be something that gives you an energy boost, basically. And it contains keynotes of magnolia and osmanthus. So how did this one smell to me? So Vroom, I can't say the fragrance name. So Vroom opens citrusy and clean, but also quite soft. It's not really a fragrance that makes me think of something lemony or something orangey. It's not as sharp as those two extremes. It's more like something like a citron or something where there's a little bit of a dull bitterness rather than something really juicy and fresh. I also think this makes me think of like a frosting almost. It's something that does have quite a sweetness to it and quite a density to it. This fragrance really quickly turns quite floral though, and the magnolia really comes through at this point. So it goes really smooth and really petally, and also it goes incredibly sweet. Also the osmanthus begins to come through, it becomes much more fruity, turns a little bit apricot-y almost. and you just get more of a texture to it. It becomes quite a citrusy, fruity floral fragrance with sort of musky, woody, also soapy tones to it. It's also quite sweet. As this dries down further, it becomes to smell something more like an apricot curd. It becomes a lot more creamy, and also the woodiness really starts to amp up. The woodiness is sort of along the lines of cedar actually in this fragrance. It's definitely a warm woodiness. I found this fragrance to be relatively long lasting and actually relatively strong compared with the others as well. So did this fragrance remind me of any others that I've tried? I don't think it did, no, but I'm just not someone who tends to gravitate towards peachy, apricotty fragrances, osmanthus fragrances in general. I think that's just not my favourite area of the fragrance wheel really. So this one to me smells unique, but I doubt that it is unique. I bet there are other fragrances that do smell quite like this one. So that's Vroom. So having tried all 5 of these fragrances, how do I feel about them and would I buy any of them? Well, I think really for me these are quite overpriced at £195 for 100ml. At that price, I want to be wowed by something, and I can't say that I was wowed by any of these. Also, one of them completely reminded me of another fragrance, and that I found that quite disappointing really, that they weren't something more original. But I would say across this range, there is pretty much something for everybody. They've really covered a lot of the fragrance categories, and they've covered a lot of very popular DNAs in this fragrance range too. Also, the packaging is very beautiful and is clearly something that attracted me to this range in the first place. And also there are these sample sets available if you do want to try this range. So how would I rank these fragrances according to my order of preference? Well, number 5, I would understandably put as Kiss of Bliss. A Kiss of Bliss for me was just too much texture. There was too much of that aroma chemical feel in the fragrance, and that really put me off it. But I also did think that it was a very inventive fragrance. As much as I didn't enjoy the matcha feel of it and that kind of cottony clover feel, I did think that that was a very different thing. So I think that kind of thing could be a love or hate for people because it just is very distinctive and it is something that I haven't really smelled before. Number 4, I'm going with Vroom. As nice as it was, I just didn't find it that distinctive and it wasn't something that excited me really. I did kind of like the creamy apricotiness in the dry down, but there was also a lot of texture in that fragrance which did put me off it slightly. But, you know, not so bad and also very long lasting and actually quite strong too. Number 3 I'm going to put as a Balm of Calm. I did really like that one and I did like the woody feel and the creamy feel in that fragrance, but I don't think it's that distinctive because it's something that really reminded me of 2 other fragrances, Gris Chanel and also Jazz Club in part. And for that reason, I just don't think that I'm that interested in that one. But it was a very relaxing feeling fragrance. It really fitted the brief very well and I did like it. Number 2 I'm going to put as Oh the Audacity. It's basically a carbon copy of Baby Cat by YSL at points in this fragrance. And I really think that really Dominic Ropignon's just duped his own fragrance. But, you know, if you are looking for Baby Cat, and a lot of people are looking for Baby Cat, then that's going to be a good thing for you. I do just think that vanilla is a mass appealing note and it's something that I think a lot of people would really love. It's not really one for me, but I can see that one being popular. So my number 2 is Oh the Audacity. And my number 1 from this collection would be Liquid Love. And the reason I'm picking Liquid Love is because I think that's the fragrance from the 5 that I would reach for the most often. And I think if you're paying that much for a fragrance, you would want to choose one that you would wear quite a lot of time. I think, you know, peppery roses, they're quite common, aren't they? But I think that one's just really nicely done, especially in the opening. I love the stemminess, I love the greenness, and I love the zinginess of the opening of that fragrance. And I think it's just a really good example of a peppery rose. So that's my number 1, Liquid Love. So please let me know, have you tried any of this range and what did you think of them? Do you own any of this range? Do you think that some of these fragrances really make you think of other fragrances? And if so, which ones? Do you get reminded of YSL Baby Cat by Oh the Audacity? Does a Balm of Calm really make you think of Gris Chanel? Please let me know down below and thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already done so, then please do consider subscribing and also please like this video and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.